So Jennifer Ruth Hosek is an associate professor of German at Queen's University in Ontario, where she is also affiliated with Film and Media Studies, Cultural Studies, and the University of Havana Queen's Exchange. Before going to Canada, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford and earned her PhD in comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Hosek publishes mainly on transnational German cultural and film studies. In her 2012 monograph, Sun, Sex, and Socialism, Cuba in the German Imaginary, Dr. Hosek investigates overlooked influences on the post-Second World War Germany's understandings of national identity. Her study demonstrates that as a site of projection and possibility in German literature and film, Cuba furthered inter-German alliances and inspired attempts for change at home. She reveals rarely seen perspectives that prevailing geopolitical narratives pre- and post-1989 obscure, and helps us to understand national identity more completely by uncovering the unexpected influences of a southern nation on northern nations. Her innovative transnational approach exemplifies the ways in which scholars, and we in general, can productively assess the interrelations of a globalized world past and present. That is not, however, what she'll be talking about today primarily. She instead will be looking at East German fictions on blooming landscapes and talking walls. In particular, how art, especially films, shape our understandings of unification and its aftermath. Okay, so we welcome Dr. Hosek.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here, and I completely agree. It's really inspiring to see the students so engaged. It's a model for all of us that we hope our students are just as engaged as you all are. And I'd like to really thank everybody, particularly Brooke, for all her work. This talk is it is long. It's about 45 minutes, and I'm dividing it, or it's divided at the beginning. I'm talking about my own life, and then I'm talking about Goodbye Lenin and Lives of Others, and I know that many of you have seen those films, and then I'm talking about After the Wall, so a more socio-political perspective. Between my 2 years in junior college at University of Maryland Munich campus in Germany, there was a small school back in the day, and my 2 years at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, USA, I took a year at Friedrich-Alexander-Universität in Erlangen. I lived with my parents who were stationed there. Walking down the staircase from my bedroom one morning, I saw my agitated mother in the hallway. Hearing her words, I thought she meant that the wall in our row house had been destroyed, possibly by an errant bulldozer from a nearby construction site. At the university, my friend invited me to drive to Berlin with him in his Ente, his little 2 chevaux Citroën with a cloth roll top and a broken heater. No, he didn't know where he was going to sleep when he got there. No, he didn't know anyone in Berlin. My parents were silently relieved when I did not go. I don't know how much of that decision of mine involved fear of cold nights in the roll-top duck and unpredictable crowds. I was rather young at the time. And I don't know how much of my decision to stay put in the deep south of Germany was the one that I articulated to myself a bit later. That is, it's a festivity for Germans. Americans, we who have been occupying the Federal Republic for so long in various ways, have no place at this party. Over the next months, I did come to know that it wasn't just me who had the sense that my predictable, comfortable Western world was being irreversibly destabilized. I wasn't sure whether my folks would be sent back to the States, away from Germany, my country of birth, and the only one in which I had ever lived. I wasn't sure how Erlangen and Ansbach and other small towns would do financially if the large bases nearby them closed. It was just so weird to think about the Federal Republic, the Germany of the Green Movement, of a very limited defensive army, of near full employment, becoming so big and diverse and perhaps, again, so powerful. On Ansbach High School trips to West Berlin, I had been awakened early mornings by Russian soldiers checking passports of the U.S. Armed Forces on the so-called duty train crossing the Democratic Republic of Germany. In those darknesses of excitement and potential danger, at that point it was not really danger anymore, our chaperones admonished us not to talk to East German guards. Communication went from one superpower to another, even at the individual level. In West Berlin, Just like kids in the States, we represented our school in sports, in drama, in academic bowl. We were the Ansbach Cougars. In West Berlin, not at all like kids in the States, my Girl Scout troop stood on the viewing platform at Brandenburg Gate looking over the Berlin Wall while the East was parsed for us. The sun shining, reflected in the shape of a cross from the globe of the Alex television tower. This golden reflection, our guide told us, was God's revenge against the communists for having melted down church steeples and bells to create that enormous globe. And yes, at 12, I surely did believe his every word. How weird, then, in 1989, to imagine that tiny, to me, exotic island of West Berlin simply melding into the eastern countryside around it. How weird that suddenly, rather than having to hope that our soldiers would be able to close off the so-called Fulda Gap in case of Russian attack, we had the vast East open to us. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia was nearby like Munich had always been. Indeed, one day, having seen a notice in the Stars and Stripes newspaper about a celebration about the end of World War II, my father, the veteran, and I simply got in the car and drove to Pilsen. And were feted by many, many inhabitants as liberators, for while the Russians took over later, it was the Americans who had marched into Pilsen. I wrote the extremely foreign name of our hotel on my hand in order to find our way back at night. We enjoyed vodka and enormous chunks of bologna and raw white onions from paper cups at bars temporarily converted from street-level home garages. When Dad gave in to sleep, college students took me to visit their dorms and a state disco, where I was amazed at their pop music and their fashions that had been existing in alternative parallel realities. All of us struggled to communicate in German, not Czech, not Russian, not English, our lives geographically so close and politically and culturally so far. I remember that it was weirdly uncomfortable when parking lots and the shops in our small Erlangen were overrun on the weekends by people with funny license plates on their cars. And yes, in the movies they did buy bananas and oranges. They probably bought a lot of other stuff too, but how amazing it was when I gave a share ride to an East German who was traveling with the 100 D-Mark welcome money, Begrüßungsgeld, and lots of trust. I asked him to give me an East German mark as payment, and I still have it. How exotic it was when dear Alex, the super savvy, super hip, Munich-born pastor's son of our social group, met a student from East Germany and brought her to us in Bavaria one Christmas time. She, that invader with too much makeup and a weird accent. It's been many years now since he's gone back to the roots. His wife is from the Allgäu, and they make a great couple. The famous marriage between East and West remains fraught. Over the last 25 years, cultural texts have been variously involved in narrating the end of the GDR and the beginning of a larger FRG. Until recently, literature and film about these topics by Easterners and Westerners have been humorous. Why? Jill Twark presents some reasons in her work on Eastern German literature of the 1990s. Drawing on Kant, she reminds that laughter releases tensions caused by unexpected events. Drawing on Freud, she suggests that lowered inhibitions, for instance in new surroundings, engender humor. The comedic expressed artists and audiences dealing with change and its resultant disorientations. Yet let's also remember Mikhail Bakhtin's work on the upside-down world of carnival. It describes how humor can at least temporarily invert power dynamics and create distinctions and distance. Using Bakhtin, we can see how through humor, former East German citizens gained at least symbolic leverage against the power of the defunct GDR and the new FRG system. When thinking about humor in this way, we can see that it's useful to differentiate between critical humor, which tends to unsettle situations, and affirmative humor, which aims to entertain and which seeks to stabilize situations. Many Wende films by Eastern Germans are satirical. This expressive mode developed under censorship and flowered post-1990. Reinhold Steingröver has shown that satire drives the criticism of the GDR that characterizes the last of the East German DEFA film studios movies of the very early 90s. And you won't know these films, but they would be worthwhile knowing. And in fact, I'm going to be showing you a clip of Leipzig im Herbst, which is basically what you were riffing, that is run from Canopy Streaming, which interestingly now is offering trial subscription, so it could be a useful thing for your school to be able to have access to a lot of really interesting East German films and many other films as well. The relative lack of success of these films has many causes, including insufficient access to funding and distribution. Distribution and funding is largely Western. Moreover, these works are politically thorny. They problematize unification and reinscribe divisions between Eastern and Western Germans. I propose that these films were also unattractive because their message hampered unification by depicting a GDR that was too problematic and unattractive to be worth bringing into the FRG fold. In contrast, the initial embrace of affirmative humor in mainstream Wende films has everything to do with furthering broad-based acceptance of unification. Allow me a parenthetical insertion here. When I speak in this manner about the impact of art on society, I'm not implying a central force that determines the messages of this art. Each Hollywood film has its particular production adventure that includes who knows whom, whose pockets are deep, and what current events are hot. Each DEFA film has its particular production adventure, including who knew whom and which current events were hot. Works get made and get seen when they speak to situations in ways that speak to makers and viewers. Hollywood, with its strictures of funding and fan base, tends to play to the moneyed mainstream. DEFA, with its strictures of funding and edu-art, tended to play to the official political mainstream. And all impactful art works are responses to contemporary social questions and engage in contemporary arenas of debate. So bear that gloss in mind when I restate that films by Eastern German filmmakers that criticized the GDR and unification gained little acceptance in the early 1990s. And that, in contrast, the initial embrace of affirmative humor in mainstream Wende films had everything to do with furthering broad-based acceptance of unification. Successful mainstream post-1990 comedies cast the GDR both as quaintly interesting and as unoriginal enough to be superfluous in a near future. Such comedies placated Westerners unhappily paying solidarity taxes and instantiated conveniently nebulous and mild attitudes of inferiority and superiority. Consider The Body Helden wie Wir, co-authored by Eastern German Thomas Brüssig and directed by Western German Sebastian Petersen, with its ridiculous enlarged penis that breaches the Berlin Wall. Consider Sonnenallee, written by Brüssig, and the only mainstream hit directed by an Eastern German, Leander Hausmann. In it, East Berlin life for the high school protagonists primarily involves creating simulacra of the West, for instance, homemade drug cocktails, or in importing the real thing from the West, for example, bootlegged rock and roll albums. Globally speaking, the melodramatic comedy Goodbye Lenin is the mainstream feature on unification. I'm sure you're familiar with that film. And you probably remember the story, but briefly, it's teenaged Alex attempts to hide the end of the GDR from his mother, Christiane Kerner, with the more or less enthusiastic support of his sister Adriana, her West German boyfriend, his West Berlin colleague, and his Russian girlfriend. Alex recreates East Germany within the domestic space of the family apartment, to which he and Adriana return his invalid mother after her heart attack. The plot moves from their humorous machinations to hide the truth from Christiana through to Alex's acceptance of the new Germany. So how does humor work in Goodbye Lenin? Goodbye Lenin's humor works in two ways that further unification. First, it normalizes acceptance of the new Germany through the identificatory protagonist Alex. And second, it makes the challenges of many Eastern Germans engaging and accessible to a broad audience. The key is the voiceover is a key technique in Goodbye Lenin's affirmative humor. Alex's voice narrates the filmic events with hindsight, that is, from some today of the new Germany. Thus, right from the opening sequence, the protagonist's assimilation is a given. The plot relates not whether unification and acceptance of it happened, but rather how they happened. Comedy works against audiences feeling like Alex and they themselves had no choice in the matter. And comedy works in favor of audiences developing sympathy and solidarity with which to engage with a new Germany. The disjunctions between how viewers read events unfolding and Alex's voiceover narration of them, which is in official syntax, are funny. That is, it's funny when the story that unfolds according to the diverse motivations of the individual characters is discordantly and flatly described according to official Eastern logics that are officially becoming antiquated and official Western paradigms that are quickly becoming normative. The voiceover narrates both lighthearted moments and heavier scenes, showing negative results of unification such as unemployment and identity crisis. The humorous disjunction between the visual and the oral depictions increases the palatability of these serious topics. So that's how the humor is working. Goodbye Lenin also takes a specific further step in exploiting humor to promote acceptance of certain largely unachieved GDR ideals. It gets serious. Humor research demonstrates that the use of humor in communications increases the probability that audiences will process a given message expansively and uncritically. However, the employment of humor also decreases the possibility that audiences will take a given message seriously. Such discounting is especially probable if audiences hold attitudes that differ from those of the message. Yet audiences discount less if, after its communication in humorous terms, a message is reinvested with authority through a restoration of gravity. In such cases, the so-called sleeper effect may also have an impact. So in other words, now that you kind of get it's kind of like long, but in sum, this is the part that's easy to understand. Just said simply, when messages are communicated humorously and then restored gravity, they can impact the attitudes of even skeptical viewers, especially when the passage of time allows further rumination on the issue. And Goodbye Lenin uses precisely this technique to validate GDR ideals to potentially skeptical audiences through Alex's final voiceover interpretation of his mother's East Germany. As I described above, the voiceover generally functions humorously. The scattering of deceased Frau Kerner's ashes into the night sky, however, restores gravity, a seriousness that continues throughout the next sequence. And I'm going to show you that famous ending there of...
Oben schwebt sie jetzt und schaut vielleicht auf uns hinab und sieht uns als winzige Punkte auf unserer kleinen Erde. Genau wie damals Sigmund Jähn. Das Land, das meine Mutter verließ, war ein Land, an das sie geglaubt hatte. Und das wir bis zu ihrer letzten Sekunde überleben ließen. Ein Land, das es in Wirklichkeit nie so gegeben hat. Ein Land, das in meiner Erinnerung immer mit meiner Mutter verbunden sein wird.
Great. So that shift to gravity brings home a primary filmic message, validation of GDR ideals of cooperation and equity in an ever-expanding community of citizens. The comedy Goodbye Lenin furthers unification by honoring its pains and the left-leaning socio-political ideals so closely woven into so many German identities. If we take seriously the notion that mainstream film continues to shape societal opinion, then it makes sense that it's not until well into unification, 2006, that Das Leben der Anderen came out. Written and directed by the Western German Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck, the melodrama went on to win an Oscar and an Academy Award. Das Leben der Anderen, which many of you have seen this week, emphasizes the moral and social corruption of the GDR through a tale of surveillance. For those who haven't seen it, in 1980s East Berlin, agent Gerd Wiesler is put on the case of the playwright George Dreimann by the Minister of Culture, who has designs on Dreimann's partner, Christa Maria Seeland, an actress who suffers from substance addiction and insecurity. The film details mechanisms of state and social control throughout the robust psychological narrative in which Wiesler becomes disenchanted with the state and his role in it as he is converted by German literature, comes to identify with Dreimann, and falls in love with Seeland. At the climactic hour, Wiesler saves Dreimann from arrest and is demoted, while Seeland dies in an accident precipitated by her weak character. Specifically, Wiesler interrogates Seeland, who betrays where the typewriter that Dreimann is using to write a story about suicide in the GDR is hidden. Wiesler rushes to the couple's apartment and takes the typewriter before the search team arrives. Not knowing that their loyal fan Wiesler has moved the typewriter to save them, Seeland loses her confidence when the Stasi begins searching, runs out into the street, and is hit and killed by a passing car, dying in remorse. Dreimann is stricken with grief, but his life goes on. 2 fast-forward years later show him with a new girlfriend in the audience of his new play. Then the wall is breached, and shortly after unification, ex-agent Wiesler finds Dreimann's new novel displayed prominently in the Karl Marx bookstore in Berlin. Its grateful dedication to his agent codename demonstrates that, after reading his own Stasi files, Dreimann knows the truth, and this truth has been productive for him as a writer. Thus, the 2 men who had been at such odds in the GDR are reconciled in the new, seemingly more transparent Germany. I suggest that it was not expedient to broadly disseminate the intense criticism that Das Leben der Anderen levels against the GDR in the first decade-plus years after the dismantling of the wall, a period when the success of unification was paramount. To be sure, in circles of the formally educated, criticism of Eastern intellectuals and the role of Eastern culture in the GDR became more pronounced. For instance, relationships between artists and police regulatory agencies were scrutinized. Narratives about collaboration were generally told from distinctly Western understandings of artistic creation in which the market is the only acceptable patron. Otherwise put, the practice of informal collaboration, such as Christa Maria's actions in the film, was anathema to educated Westerners. Westerners were accustomed to societal structures that engender the possibility of artistic voice and demand that artists themselves provide the means of amplification, i.e. funding. Thus, for many, it was impossible to discover that members of the avant-garde Berlin Prenzlauer Berg group worked as Stasi informants and still value their artistic work. Such events that by normative Western logics cast the GDR in quite a negative light were not of concern, of course, in Sonnenallee or Goodbye Lenin. My comments till now may tempt you to conclude that mainstream Wende narratives in mainstream films up until Das Leben der Anderen aimed to show Eastern values respectfully, such as is arguably done in the denouement of Goodbye Lenin, which we just saw. Therefore, since I don't really agree with that, let me sketch you the story of this very famous story of Was bleibt by Christa Wolf, who's a very famous GDR writer and very well respected in the West and the East. Her admission in the early 1990s that she had briefly worked as an informant caused a furor. Her publication of the autobiographical short story, Was bleibt, What Remains, in which the protagonist describes being observed by secret agents, then blew the roof off. Wolf was lambasted for opportunism. As Anna Kuhn has famously shown, however, such criticism was disingenuous. The female and therefore more vulnerable Wolf was the scapegoat for all GDR intellectuals who were critical of both the GDR and the FRG. Perhaps this is also why Wolf's novels Cassandra and Medea, both of which call in certain ways for a third way, are seldom classified as Wende novels. Up until today, the most unsettling and unacceptable stories are those that earnestly call both systems into question. These are the tales most seldom told. Das Leben der Anderen unabashedly faces west. The 2006 film may be seen as responding to so-called nostalgie, or nostalgia for the East. Now, we've seen a representation of Ostalgie in Goodbye Lenin, arguably. In that scene, looking back allows idealism, but risks rose tinting. Similarly, Ostalgie has frequently been interpreted as misguided rose tinting of past life in an authoritarian land. Daniel Boyer's work has brought a trenchant corrective to this common notion of ostalgie by showing how positions dismissed as ostalgic might be quite sober, logical desires for a world of employment and security, affordable education and healthcare, childcare, that kind of stuff. Indeed, we might also talk of a vestalgie, such as I myself felt at the thought of the end of my very comfortable West German existence. Das Leben der Anderen engages with all versions of ostalgie by eradicating its origins at the root by presenting a monolithically negative GDR. Nothing remains, if nothing of value ever existed. For this pro-West, anti-ostalgie film to be effective, its depiction of the GDR must be seen as authentic. Von Donnersmarck has repeatedly emphasized not only the authenticity of the fictional reality in the film, but also his authentic Eastern voice. By reminding us that he is a Westerner, I do not, however, mean to negate his right to tell a story, because I certainly don't want to imply that people can only speak authentically about their own lives, because otherwise we could all just talk monologues and basically just forget communication. But it is important to note that he and viewers, it's important to note that he and the viewers place importance on this fiction films. Let me just start that over because it is important here. Instead, it is to note the importance he and viewers place on this fiction film's telling of a true story. True stories are first and foremost where we go to find out facts. So through its putative authenticity, Das Leben der Anderen purports to tell us about the facts of the GDR. Because of Das Leben der Anderen's truth claims, it's all the more striking that this melodrama exemplifies a shift in mainstream narratives about the merger. As Germany's unified history lengthens and Germany's position normalizes within the European Union, NATO, and the United Nations, serious GDR critique has a role to play in influencing and articulating public opinion. Das Leben der Anderen may be, in Tony Case's well-known phrase, a return of a repressed desire of Westerners to disparage the GDR, an impulse that many resisted through the fragile beginnings of unification, as I just described. And such critique also articulates neoliberal affinities. Contemporary, hard-hitting disparagement of state socialism underlines interest in on-the-ground organized struggle against contemporary socio-political systems, like Occupy, like lots of stuff that is, kind of healthy debate, arguably, depending on where you stand. Add to that fictional narratives often remain largely personal and avoid engagement with structural questions. For instance, in Goodbye Lenin, social ideals are embodied primarily in Alex's mother. For instance, in Das Leben der Anderen, sentiments are most strikingly depicted by the Stasi protagonist Wiesler's personal discovery of Bertolt Brecht's writing. Some interpretations of Das Leben der Anderen argue that the GDR is misrepresented as a tame, bourgeois-oriented land that simply could not offer its citizens a standard of living or a standard of freedom comparable to the West. Could be. And I suggest that far more to the point here is the way that the film returns to romantic and in post-Nazi times arguably reactionary notions of art's ability to save humanity. What kind of art is it that can save humanity? According to Das Leben der Anderen, certainly not art that is state-funded. Dreimann's theater seems to have no emancipatory effect on his society. In contrast, the market enables free expression, whether in the journalism that Dreimann undertakes to expose the prevalence of suicides in the GDR or in his novel about his Stasi experience. Dreimann easily shifts from a regular salary as an artist in the GDR to a financially secure life as a playwright and novelist in unified Germany. This plot development is not authentic according to statistical probability. Dreimann's easy shift elides questions about the form and scope of art in subsidized and in precarious market conditions of production. And what about Zeeland, Christa Maria? It's a truism that sadly still holds true. Men are seen as the ones who make history. In Das Leben der Anderen, this tradition snaps back into place with a vengeance. I mentioned to you the German romantic notion of art as humanizing. In this paradigm, Germany is the chosen land of Dichter und Denker, of poets and thinkers. Since Nazi ideologies exposed the dangers in this exceptionalist thinking, much work has been done to nuance such thinking about art in order to mitigate chauvinism. Similarly, much work has sought to dislodge historical patriarchal norms that fed Nazi ideology. Hence my dismay at what I see as a step back on two levels in Das Leben der Anderen. The film both establishes its own plot as a his story and depicts a GDR in which women's roles are completely insignificant. To consider the role of Christa Maria one of the only female characters in the melodrama is enough to explain what I mean. This is a homosocial story. Nearly all of its players are men, and more importantly, it is the tale of a relationship between two men who between themselves write history. The Stasi employee Wiesler, who writes, and the artist Dreimann, who writes. At first at odds, their politico-personal expression is ultimately united across the body of the woman in Dreimann's novel. The red thumbprint of Dreimann, who moves the typewriter with its red ink ribbon. I hope it's dark enough to see. Christa Maria's white bathrobe, stained with her life blood. Wiesler's red ink thumbprint in Dreimann's file. Dreimann's book dedication to Wiesler. And finally, the moment at which the commodity fetish is turned on its head as a homosocial communication reaches its apex in Wiesler's purchase of Dreimann's cultural production, his book. So Dreimann's inscription with gratitude brings the point home. Although Wiesler's actions brought on Christa Maria's death, they saved Dreimann's life. In contrast, Christa Maria fails to write history. As an actress, she is a mouthpiece, not a voice. But more than this, she is the commodity, the exchange of which engenders the males to struggle against and with each other and themselves, and perhaps to come to personal growth. She is the body, the muse, the seductress, but weak, unprincipled, hypersexualized. Her insecurity and failings lead to her downfall. Neither can she kick her addiction, nor can she imagine that her loyal public embodied in Wiesler could move the typewriter to save her. Zeeland's weakness betrays Dreimann and reminds us of that other truism that, at least in melodrama, it's always the woman's fault. Does Das Leben der Anderen authentically reflect life in the GDR and the lives of women in the GDR? Well, East German film has a plethora of strong female protagonists who have very little in common with Christa Maria. And at the same time, life in the GDR was more patriarchal in practice than in theory. And at the same and I urge you to study more about this German land. There's so much to know. My comments so far underline that fiction is one of the ways that walls can talk. Documentaries speak volumes too. Neither fiction nor documentary tells the truth. But documentaries gain their authority and authenticity through a pledge to share a reality rather than a fiction. As part of our commemoration tonight, I will now show you some footage of those momentous days in November 1989. They're from Leipzig im Herbst, a documentary filmed by Gerd Krossek and Andreas Vogt, then filmmakers of the DEFA East German Film Studios. And this will just take 1 second because I need to get into my account quickly. So this is all documentary. It's kind of an amazing story how they just took the cameras and went out and filmed.
Durch das Wochenende, wenn ich das bloß mit SNP und mit freier Armee schaffen kann, verzichte ich.
Problem. What do we do? I can see it. Something we hadn't thought about. Let's see. So this is somebody speaking, and then this is sort of the warm up for the. You'll see the camera will take you up into a.
Ich lieber Kleid drauf. Und da bin ich ein einfacher Arbeiter geworden. Ich bin sehr zufrieden mit meiner Arbeit. Vorher war ich politisch normalerweise überhaupt nicht engagiert, bis mit der jetzigen Zeit wurde das im Grunde genommen unabwendbar. Ich bin jetzt am letzten Mittwoch ins neue Forum eingetreten, um auch ein bisschen aktiver mit dazu beizutragen, dass sich was tut endlich. Auch in meinem Betrieb Leute anzusprechen, in der Hoffnung, dass sie Mut haben, ins neue Forum einzutreten und auch ihre Meinung laut äußern. Mit zur Demonstration zu kommen, die montags stattfindet. Und dass wir wahrscheinlich eine Gruppe im Betrieb aufbauen können, um dann endlich mal mit den Leuten reden zu können, was wir vorhaben. Und Sozialismus abschaffen will ja überhaupt keiner. Wir wollen den ja bloß verbessern. Und der muss verbessert werden. Und so kann er nicht weiter existieren, wie er jetzt momentan noch versucht zu existieren.
Und lassen sich nicht mehr hier unter Druck setzen. Was haben Sie denn hier davon gehabt? Sie sind unter Druck gesetzt gewesen, konnten sich nirgendwo frei entscheiden, konnten ihre Meinung keinen Ausdruck verleihen und so weiter und so fort, konnten nicht reisen, konnten nichts. Warum soll es hier bleiben? Was gibt es dafür als plausiblen Grund? Das kann ich dir sagen. Das jetzt geschafft, dass das nicht ersetzen kann. Ja, aber ich lag vor mir schon also mindestens 1000 andere, die aufgrund dessen, was ich jetzt hier mache, als zum Beispiel im Westen geschoben wurden und nicht freiwillig dahin. Das ist Straftatbestand. Also pass mal auf, vor einem halben Jahr konnte sich aber keiner ausschließen, dass eine Entwicklung einsetzt, die uns hier zum Beispiel im Moment wirklich zu arbeiten. Und deswegen verstehe ich das durchaus. Wenn Leute gesagt haben an der Stelle, nee, jetzt ist Schluss, das sehe ich nicht mehr ein, ich gehe jetzt, die einfach resigniert haben auch. Also erachte ich durchaus als möglich und das entspricht auch den Menschenrechtsbestimmungen, dass sie sich dafür frei entscheiden können. Und ich bin hundertprozentig davon überzeugt, dass es, wenn es hier ein funktionierendes sozialistisches System geben wird, also in absehbarer Zeit irgendwann mal, dass dann auch wieder Leute sagen, wir würden auch gerne zurückkommen. Da bin ich hundertprozentig davon überzeugt. Wenn angeblich hier von Dialog geredet wird, also wir sind zum Beispiel der Meinung, dass zurzeit überhaupt kein Dialog passiert. Was hier passiert, ist eine Anhörung. Das heißt, es gibt jetzt möglicherweise das Recht von, also die SED gibt den Leuten großzügig das Recht, sich erstmal anzuhören von bestimmten Gruppen mehr, von bestimmten Gruppen weniger, was sie erstmal zu sagen haben. Ein gleichberechtigter Dialog, der findet hier im Moment überhaupt nicht statt. Und ohne diesen gleichberechtigten Dialog wird es hier auch überhaupt keine Form von Demokratie geben.
Wir machen einfach los und arbeiten so lange, bis mal irgendwas passiert. Wir haben also jetzt hier mit einem Büro- und Informationszentrum eingerichtet und sind bis jetzt noch nicht belangt worden.
Und wir hoffen, dass die Registrierung demnächst erfolgen kann.
Wir hoffen es auf alle Fälle, natürlich. Es sind zwar zurzeit noch keine Anzeichen da, außer dass lokale Vertreter sich für die Genehmigung einsetzen wollen, also höhere Parteifunktionäre auch. Ob das stimmt, ob die sich wirklich einsetzen und ob die den Einfluss haben, das können wir eben noch nicht einschätzen. Wahrscheinlich 3000 etwa, man kann es nur überschlagen, 3000. In der DDR, das ist nicht feststellbar, also 50 bis 100.000 schätze ich.
It's quite impressive, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, wow. you just they didn't really know like what's going to happen, and just try to see what happens. So it's really worth watching that documentary. It's really powerful. To my mind, the most important questions are what actual freedoms remain from these heady days, days in which the people of East Germany wanted enfranchisement, a larger say in government and societal structuring, opportunities for travel and public expression, and opportunities for personal growth. You may be familiar with the concept of the noble lie from Plato's Republic. A noble lie is a myth or untruth knowingly told by an elite to maintain social harmony or to advance an agenda. I suggest that noble lies told by politicians like the then Chancellor Helmut Kohl shaped the future of most East Germans in 1989-1990 when decisions were being made as to how unification should be carried out, as well as how Eastern Germans in united Germany ultimately fared. The Christian Democratic Party that was in power in West Germany from the 1980s and then unified Germany until 1998 promised Eastern Germans blooming landscapes of economic prosperity if unification were pulled through quickly and on Western German terms. For most Eastern Germans, these blooming landscapes did not become their reality. They indeed had more freedom in the sense of freedom to choose their government. They had more freedom from taxation in that those who remained employed received a higher percentage of remuneration for their labor in the form of wages than in the form of subsidized goods and services. And those who had the means to travel indeed had the freedom to travel. On the other hand, many, if not perhaps most, Eastern Germans did not want freedom in the form that they got it, which was based on the West German model. They wanted the freedom to choose democratic socialism, as evidenced by the 1989-1990 Neues Forum and other citizens' movements. And this possibility was steamrolled by 1990. Moreover, only some Eastern German individuals ended up with more freedom of choice and action and purchasing power. Most Eastern Germans instead soon had and have the freedom to choose, but not the capacity to choose. They have gained political power and lost economic power. Indeed, I suggest that the example of the fall of the wall begs the question of the relationship between these two freedoms and suggests the necessity for all individuals to have economic freedom in order to have political and other freedom. Economic freedom is a necessary, although not sufficient, condition. Let me give you two examples of how many Eastern Germans lost freedoms with the end of the GDR. First was the redistribution of wealth in the form of East German property. Remember the scene in Goodbye Lenin when the East German money that the family had hidden was worth nothing? Alex had found it too late to exchange it for a value of 2 East marks for 1 West mark. This is only a small part of the story of liquid assets. What about wealth in the form of infrastructure? Many enterprises in East Germany were national, meaning that each citizen owned a portion. However, in 1990, rather than dividing the value and or ownership of these enterprises among these citizens, they were put in the hands of the Treuhand holding company. They were then sold off to bidders. Frequently, these bidders were West German companies, and frequently these bidders had an interest in seeing these enterprises fail, because otherwise they could mean competition with the existing company in the West. And by this, I'm not pretending that the standards were the same, and certainly some of the speakers were, talked about problems with sort of ineffective use of manpower and not the most up-to-date technology and so forth. Nevertheless, it's simply clear that there was value in factories, for example, and that the people did not get any part of that, and instead frequently there were these sorts of problems that I'm describing. Frequently, sweetheart deals were struck whereby the government would support the Western buyers with subsidies for some years, after which point the company would pull out of the purchase, leaving the enterprise in bankruptcy. In all of this, the Eastern Germans lost freedoms both because they lost equity in the firms and because they often lost their jobs. At the same time, they lost liberty in the sense that they lost agency. For instance, many could not afford to remain where they grew up or to keep performing the same career. They needed to move to where the jobs were and take new employment, often employment far below their training. Women were a group particularly affected by abridgment of freedom, and this is my second example. In 1989, East Germany, 83% of women between 16 and 60 were working for pay outside of the home or were training for such work. Notwithstanding Marxist-Leninist theory, in practice, the East German system de facto tended to favor men's advancement in the workplace. It also expected women to bear a triple burden of work, community service, and family. And at the same time, the state and society truly supported women so that they were able to be such superwomen. In unified Germany, these women have suffered major losses in economic freedom, as has been touched on today so far. By 1993, unemployment among Eastern German men was 11%, and among Eastern German women, 21%. There are several reasons for this large disparity. One is that Eastern German women tended to have fewer transferable skills because they were performing less skilled labor in East Germany. Another is that the Western German system tends not to support working mothers, as we heard. Hence, many Eastern German women with children could not combine remunerated labor with child rearing. In addition to this decrease in economic flexibility, Eastern German women have lost freedoms in unified Germany because the social system is based on a West German model. In this model, women do not have full legal independence. 1, unmarried women live under official guardianship on behalf of their children. 2, economic and social benefits such as childcare days for needier people, often single mothers, are few. 3, the law subsidizes joint filing of taxes to wage-earning women's detriment. 4, spousal pensions can only be claimed by married partners. And 5, the family support principle means that the family must assist needy members before receiving assistance from the state. And generally, family caregivers are women. Furthermore, Eastern women's right to choose has been curtailed. In East Germany, women could choose abortion in the first trimester. In West Germany, in contrast, the 1970s up to '89 was marked by struggles to legalize abortion. In 1993, after much struggle by Western and Eastern activists, a restrictive law was put into effect under which abortion is considered illegal and punishable unless approved by a doctor for the mother's health. The doctor must stress the importance of the unborn life to the pregnant woman. Insurance generally only covers abortion undertaken to safeguard the physical health. Since 1993, then, freedom of choice for the Eastern woman is largely out of her hands, depending on your point of comparison. And freedom in Europe, that polity without internal borders and with Schengen walls. In today's EU, bureaucrats are increasingly determining financial policies and governments, not the people. Traditionally, in democracies, elected officials decide what to do with their currency, whether to inflate or deflate its value, for instance. In Europe today, the influence of citizens on the economic and political processes is being abridged in the sense that fewer and fewer influential actors are elected at all, because more and more are being appointed. In 2012, in a show of support for its experiment, Europe received the Nobel Peace Prize. The EU has been based on a spirit of peace and cooperation. I hope that it will find a real return to one of its founding principles, democracy. They might look to the spirit of the Neues Forum, at which, in 1989-1990, a group of citizens from West and East got together and hammered out plans for how they wanted unified Germany to be governed and how its laws should look. This was a democratic process in action and a model for real freedom. Thank you.